I'm Jack Forster, Editor-in-Chief at Hodinkee.com, and today I have the distinct privilege of bringing you Mr. Jason Heaton, world traveler, adventurer, diver, writer, novelist, and the man who taught me to walk up a steep slope efficiently in Iceland. Jason, it's fantastic to have you on. I've been looking forward to doing something like this with you for as long as we've known each other, which is quite a long time.
It has been a long time, yeah. We met on an adventure of its own over in Portugal a few years back.
We certainly did. We certainly did. And we've been lucky enough to have been around the world a few times together. But this is the first time that you've actually had a chance to sit down with us and talk about your own collection. How did you get into all this? Did the watches come first? Did the diving come first? Did they both kind of happen together?
You know, I was always a bit of a watch guy, even dating back to high school. I bought a Seiko diver when I was a junior in high school. You know, cut grass to save money to buy it and bought it at a mall jeweler. It was such a powerful sort of talisman for me. You know, I just felt like a superhero or something wearing that watch. It was this big, chunky, Pepsi bezeled Seiko. And that's kind of where it all began. But then, you know, years since, I was always wearing a watch no matter what I did. And when I started freelance writing, I was working for Gear Patrol at the time, and I was doing outdoor gear reviews, so kayaks, bikes, backpacks, that sort of thing, and that kind of led to watches. And at that time, I was just discovering kind of high-end watches, and I bought an Omega Planet Ocean, and it was a dive watch, of course, but I didn't know how to dive, and I thought, I really need to know how to dive if I'm going to own a dive watch. I felt like a poser, you know? So I took up diving 2006 or 2007, and that led to kind of this building premise of doing watch reviews underwater, you know, taking these watches diving. And of course that required photography to go along with it. And my wife, Gashani, learned to dive around the same time, and she was taking topside photos of all this gear I was reviewing. And so we bought an underwater housing, and it sort of grew from there. And I went from Gear Patrol to Hodinkee. I worked with you a bit at Revolution when we were both there. And you know, one thing's led to another. I think I've probably taken, gosh, I think at last count, it's probably over 200 watches underwater, so.
Good heavens, good heavens. So what do you got for us?
All right, so I brought all dive watches, and I'm going to kind of present them in chronological order from kind of their age. So the first watch I have is the 1969 Doxa Sub 200 T-Graph, Shark Hunter is what they called it. This is a hand-wound chronograph that Doxa made very few of back in the late 60s. And it's such a quirky, strange watch with these kind of funky hand shapes and colors on the dial. It uses their patented no-deco bezel scale. And then the fact that it's a hand-wound two-register chronograph just makes it that much more unique. There are very few of these around. I actually have another one. I have a silver dial one that I bought from a vintage dealer in Chicago. But this one came to me because I had written about the silver dial one for Hodinkee, and a guy just out of the blue sent me an email and said, I have an old one of these T-Graphs, and I found your article online, and I don't wear it anymore, and I'd like to sell it. Do you have any resources, on where I can sell it? And I kind of said, I'll take it.
Have you come to the right place?
Turns out this guy lives in Oregon. He's a carpenter or woodworker. He's in his 60s now, I believe, and retired, semi-retired. But he grew up in the Chicago area, and he learned to dive at the very beginnings of PADI. So PADI is the Professional Association of Diving Instructors. Actually was started in Chicago, and he has one of the original PADI open water certification cards that he got when he was 18 years old. And because he was diving, he needed a watch, and he went into a Chicago dive shop and bought this watch. And he wore it for most of his life. And he wore it diving, and he wore it on family vacations just up the road from where I am now in northern Minnesota. And he loved this watch, but it had outlived its usefulness for him. So I bought it, and this was in 2019, so it was the 50th anniversary of the watch, which actually he bought in 1970, wow. But the watch is a 69. So the watch is basically as old as I am. And I really wanted to have it serviced and take it diving to kind of honor its 50th anniversary. So I took it to a local watchmaker who painstakingly took it apart, cleaned it, fashioned parts that he needed, sourced a crown and a new crystal, got new seals for it, and refurbished it. And I took it diving in 2019 in Bonaire. You know, it's one of those watches that's quirky, it's big, it sits tall on the wrist, and I don't know, to me it's one of those pieces that just screams adventure. You know, it just looks like the kind of watch you're going to explore the world in.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
So in chronological order, what's next?
So this is an Aquastar Benthos 500. It has a central minute sweep hand. So the chronograph only counts minutes up to 60, and it's a flyback. So this button down here at, I guess it would be about 4 o'clock, if you press that, it starts this central orange hand, and it will count up to 60 minutes, which is incredibly useful for a diver. You know, as you're descending, you could push the button to start your bottom time tracking, and then you can use the bezel for tracking other things like swim distances or surface intervals or things like that. It was reputed to be one of the first 500-meter rated diving watches, hence the name Benthos 500. And what I really like about this watch and just Aquastar in general is that the brand was born as a brand to be solely about water sports. And I think the Benthos is a watch that kind of speaks to that. It's another one of those watches that was so purpose-built for a specific function with solving problems for divers in mind. In the case of the Doxa, it was the no decompression scale bezel. With the Benthos, you know, you have this central counter for tracking bottom time, which would just be immensely useful to a diver. And I wish there were more dive watches now that had that feature.
So I'm gonna be flabbergasted if the next watch is also a dive chronograph?
Sort of it is. Now this is a bit out of left field, so now we're skipping ahead from the 70s to the 80s. This is a Citizen Aqualand. It was the COO23, introduced in 1985, allegedly the first dive watch with analog digital display and a depth gauge. And it does have a chronograph, it does have a digital chronograph. This watch, to me, and again, this was the subject of a story I wrote for Hodinkee, because I feel like this watch doesn't get its proper due from watch enthusiasts. This was possibly the zenith of dive watch design and the last of the great tool dive watches, because I think after this point, come the late 80s, early 90s, you start getting into digital dive computers. Analog dive watches were starting to go by the wayside. And this watch was on the cutting edge with its depth gauge function. And you know, you'd see divers, even to this day, wearing old beat-up Aqualands because they're just such rugged, purpose-built, you know, functional tools. I sourced this one, I think, on eBay or something, because I've always liked this particular model. It still has very classic looks with the hands and the markers and the bezel. You know, Citizen in more recent years has gone to kind of more of an analog display of depth, which I find a little less intuitive and hard to read, and a little more kind of funky looking cases and things. And this one just has that classic look. And so I wanted to have this brought up to snuff so I could take it diving. And I had it in the Maldives a couple of years ago and took it diving there. And it works great. I love depth gauge dive watches. I think, again, such a useful feature to be able to look down at your wrist and see the numbers tick up as you're headed deeper.
You made an interesting point a few minutes ago, which is that this is really the last of the purpose-built dive watches before the beginning of the dawn of the era, when digital dive computers, with all of their indisputably more advanced features, kind of came along and turned the dive watch into a backup instrument rather than a sort of a primary timing instrument. So the next watch that you're going to show us is a mechanical watch, I believe, unless you got another quartz guy.
I do have another quartz watch. This is actually from 1995. This is a CWC, so Cabot Watch Company, Royal Navy dive watch. It's a British brand that was founded by the former managing director of Hamilton in the UK in the early 70s. And what I like about CWC is that, at least up until recent years, this is a watch that wasn't a big brand like Omega or Rolex or Seiko or anybody that adapted its luxury timepieces to be used by military. This was a brand that was founded solely to create watches from a specification only to sell to the military. So for a long time, the only way you could get these watches is if they were decommissioned or lost or somehow spirited away from their active duty and sold privately. And this one in particular, I bought from a guy who had a bit of a shadowy past and told me that, you know, I can't tell who he is or something like this, but he said he was with the Special Boat Service. So he was with the SBS did some other interesting sort of mercenary jobs after he retired from there. And so he sold me this watch. It was actually issued in 1995 and saw active duty on the wrist of an SBS operative. That history alone is great, but what's significant personally to me is that being a Royal Navy watch, I decided that this would be the watch that I wore for my first dive that I did on the HMS Hermes, which was the world's first purpose-built aircraft carrier that was sunk in World War II off the east coast of Sri Lanka. And I went and dove that a few years back. It was the deepest wreck at the time that I had dived. It was about 175 feet deep. technical dive, and so I wore a dive computer on my right wrist, and then I wore this one on my left, for its Royal Navy heritage. I just thought it would be a very fitting watch. There is a watch from the 70s I'm wearing, actually. This is a Tudor Submariner, the Snowflake hand version from 1976. Everybody knows Tudor. I mean, it's just this parade of great releases in the Black Bay line recently, and they harken back to the Snowflake hand watches of the 70s that were, many of which were issued to the Marine Nationale, the French Navy divers. This watch is from 76. I bought it secondhand a few years ago when prices were still reasonable for these things. Came a little battered. It had a broken mainspring, and the bezel was kind of seized in place, but I brought it to a local Rolex shop, and the watchmaker there did a great job. He refurbished the movement, he replaced all the seals, new crown, new crystal, because again, I like that with the Doxa, I really wanted to take this watch diving. And I've taken it diving in the Bahamas, in Grand Cayman, and then I did some free diving with it in Tenerife. It's such a great watch. I think the Submariner is such an icon, but when you see a Snowflake hand Tudor from a distance, it's just so recognizable, so different than the Mercedes hand and kind of the round markers of a Rolex sub. And that's what I like about it. And then, kind of related to that, the watch that I would say is if I had one keeper, it would be my 14060M Rolex Submariner. This is a watch that I got for my 40th birthday back in 2010. I was just kind of getting into watches and dive watch reviews and this sort of thing, and I remember vacillating about which watch should I get for this momentous birthday. And the no-date sub was just at the top of the list, but it was a little bit at the top of that price range for what I wanted or what we could afford at the time. And whenever I go off on some sort of significant life adventure, this is the watch that accompanies me. So again, HMS Hermes, after I did the first dive with the CWC, I did 3 subsequent dives wearing the Rolex sub. I summited Mount Rainier with this watch on. I sailed in the Rolex Big Boat Series regattas out in San Francisco Bay with this watch. So it's been through a lot. And famously, during that sailing race, at one point, my job, being kind of the big guy on the boat, was, I don't know anything about sailing. You're going to be up front. You're jumping halyards. So when the sail changes come, I'm the guy that has to sit and hoist the sail by just pulling down on this line all the time. And during the course of one of these sail changes, the edge of the bezel caught on some sort of a cable or something and flew off. And I didn't even realize it. And there I was sitting on the rail at some point, and this buddy of mine who was also part of the crew came crawling over to me, and he said, I think this must be yours. And it was a Rolex bezel that he had found, somewhere. I mean, I'm surprised it wasn't washed overboard, because we were heeling over, quite a bit. And he handed it to me, and I just, kind of grabbed it from, kind of tucked it in my pocket, and kind of went the rest of the day without the bezel on the watch, which is fine. It's working great. Didn't really need it. And then later that evening, I just popped it back on. It was missing. It's still missing the click spring, and I've kind of kept it that way. I certainly could have sourced one. But to me, it's this little memory of that adventure, and so now it's a bi-directional friction bezel.
It's like the fencing scar that you would get in Germany as an undergraduate. Sure, it's a defect technically, but it's a memento of wonderful times and wonderful memories.
Yeah. The last watch in chronological order that I have is the Bremont Supermarine 2000. Now, this was the first generation watch from that line that they came out with. It's 2,000 meter water resistant, so not only is it the most current one that I have, but it's actually the deepest diving one, not on my wrist. Bremont makes such a solid piece. It's got the hardened steel, great anti-reflective coating, the triptych case, and a great rubber strap. But I think what I like about it is, so often, and just looking at my collection here so far, the watches that we see, the dive watches, kind of all harken back to an old design, the kind of that original spec, the Blancpains, the Rolexes, the Omegas. I think it's really tough nowadays to come up with really modern design language or create something from a blank sheet of paper, and I think Bremont's been pretty successful with that. It's a very fresh watch. It's got some use of color and some dial texture, and the shape of the hands and things like that are really attractive to me, and I like wearing it. And it's a huge watch. I mean, it's 45 millimeters, but it's it works on my wrist. So,
how do you feel about having a dive watch whose water resistance significantly exceeds the crush depth of a modern nuclear attack submarine?
It's very reassuring.
It is, right? Jason, let me ask you something. Do you think of yourself as a collector? I mean, talking watches is ostensibly about, talking to people about their activities as a collector. But you're sort of, I feel this is a little bit different. I'm not talking to somebody who so much collects per se as someone who has accumulated the tools of the trade over the years.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I was going to say that I'm less a collector and more of an accumulator. I don't go at owning watches with any sort of a strategy. I admire people that have specific focus. Maybe if I were to start over again, I would only pick, twin crown, super compressor case dive watches from these years or something. But it's just been a bit haphazard, and they've just sort of come to me as I've enjoyed them. But the common thread is they don't stay long in my collection unless I do something with them, or I take them somewhere, and I try to get all my dive watches wet at least once to kind of attach some sort of memory to them. And then it's actually a lot harder to get rid of, as evidenced by this kind of weird mishmash of watches and the others that I also have.
Jason, before we go, you are the first-time novelist. You have a new book out called, I believe, Depth Charge. Without giving too much away, maybe tell us a little bit about it. I'm sure your experience as a diver has certainly informed a lot of what's in the book.
Yeah, I mean, having gone to university and studied English literature, I had years of kind of reading lots of high-minded books, Hemingway, Shakespeare, etc. And I think the thriller genre in later years kind of saved me from overanalyzing everything I read. And so I always was drawn to Ian Fleming's Bond novels, or Clive Cussler with his Dirk Pitt novels, or Alistair MacLean. And that's the kind of book I wanted to write for years. And this past year just kind of lent itself to just plowing through and finishing this book. And so, yes, there's diving adventure in it, a bit of saturation diving, as well as deep technical diving. Much of the story is set in Sri Lanka, but there's a historical element to it that takes place in World War II Britain. So it kind of brings a lot of different elements together, and it was really fun to write. It took a lot of research, and I had a lot of help with it, some good editors and a great creative designer who helped me with the cover, and it's just been such a learning experience to kind of have that perseverance and discipline to just stick with something that's 260 pages long. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
We're actually having this conversation on Earth Day, and you said something a little bit earlier that really kind of stuck with me, that having a dive watch inspired you to start to dive, and that opened up an entirely new world to you that you might not otherwise have experienced.
Yeah, I mean, I think that great icon of diving, and a consummate watch nerd himself, Jacques Cousteau, once said that, we protect what we love. And I think, how can you love the ocean or the creatures in it or care about what's happening to it more than if you're actually in it and you're actually experiencing it, and that becomes your passion and the places you go on vacation, and in my case, made a kind of a career out of it around the ocean. And so I think if I can do a small thing through my watch reviewing and my articles and my passion for dive watches can inspire even one or two or three more people to put on a watch and say, hey, I've got a dive watch. I want to go snorkeling, or I want to learn how to dive so I can use my watch. And they take it somewhere and they do that, and it opens up this world to them. They might care a little bit more about what they're seeing on the news, or that extra plastic bag they're using. I don't want to get preachy, but I do think that conservation all starts at such a small level. And if I've been able to kind of turn my interest in watches into an interest in diving into a new career, essentially, and one that is so focused on the underwater world, who knows how it can inspire somebody else. So I think, it's easy to overlook that with watches and kind of feel a little jaded about them, or think, all these brands are talking about ocean conservation and they all have special editions, but there is something to that. I think the tie between a dive watch and the ocean and essentially the Earth's environment is a very strong one, and I think it's not one we should overlook. So I kind of see it as this sort of holistic, big picture, sort of good in the world, I guess,